Be sure to subscribe and like our channel.
Welcome. This is the Queen City Curio videocast / Deeper Down the Rabbit Hole podcast. And a few announcements before we begin. As you all know, this is the Easter or Passover weekend. So tomorrow, Andrieh is going to be doing God Within, connecting to the Christos Spirit. So that's happening tomorrow at 1:30 for a sponsor. So if you're interested in that, you can become a sponsor at Queen City Curio, become a member. And you can take a look. We already have people in the States and worldwide wanting to join that. So remember, you can get all our rituals online for that. And then if you're in Toronto, well, come on in, because nothing's like festivities, like a ritual connecting to Christos within yourself. So Andrieh is going to be running that tomorrow. And then on the lineup for what's happening a few weeks after, we have the healing traumas through self-hypnosis the week after. And then we have an Archangel Haniel ritual for releasing emotional trauma, because everyone needs some healing of the heart. So we have a whole bunch of things, as you know, coming up every weekend. It's either a workshop or a ritual. It goes switching over back and forth. And then for the deeper down schedule, we also have the next week we have Carl Abrahamson. So that's going to be fun. Our times are a little bit different because he's in Sweden. So with that, we're going to be doing noon for us, which is 6 hours his time, so it'll be late for him, early for us. So just remember, we're doing that time switch for the next interview next Saturday. So with us today, we have Ronnie Pontiac. He's worked with Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. He is an award-winning documentary producer and has written Invisible College Magazine, Newtopia, Metapsychosis, and A Cult of Personality and Reality Sandwich. He lives in Los Angeles. And today's book we're talking about with him is this one right here on the screen. So if you're on YouTube, you can see this. If you're on podcast, it's the American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of a New World. So welcome to the show, Ronnie.
Thank you for having me, Zachary.
So what inspired you to write this book? Because, we've been reading it. It's a thick book. It's a good, thick book. So something inspired you to write it.
It all started when I was working at the Philosophical Research Society for Manly Hall, where he had a vault of rare books and manuscripts next to his office. And we would spend sometimes our lunches there. Since I was working on a bibliography of his alchemical collection, he would allow me to choose various books and ask him questions about them. And one of the volumes that I pulled off the shelves was this mysterious leather tome that, when I opened it, had a newspaper in it that was called The Platonist. And this newspaper had been published in about the 1880s in St. Louis, Missouri, at a time when St. Louis was still a famous cattle town, although industrialization was beginning to arrive. And the gunfight at the OK Corral happened around the same year that this was being published. And as I went through these delicate, somewhat yellowed pages, I was astonished to find that this newspaper contained translations of Plato, Iamblichus, Plotinus, and some of them by Thomas Taylor, but some of them by somebody named Thomas Johnson, who I'd never heard of. And then I ran into Alexander Wilder in there, and I had run into some Alexander Wilder books. He was the editor of Isis Unveiled for Madame Blavatsky. And then, most shockingly, Abner Doubleday, who was falsely credited with discovering baseball or inventing it, he was in there, and he had a translation of Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic and segments. It was serialized. So I was amazed at this strange remnant of a time that I really knew nothing about, because here we see that somebody took the time and the trouble to, for some reason, make a newspaper that had all this pagan and Western esoteric knowledge in it. So I asked Manly Hall about it, and he didn't know much about it either. There wasn't a lot of information available. I started to research to find out more about who was behind it. Eventually, I found a small book called Platonism in the Midwest, published in the early 60s, that raised more questions than it answered, but at least it told me something about who Thomas Johnson was. And it told me about somebody named Hiram K. Jones, who was a friend and an influence on Emerson, Thoreau, Alcott, all the transcendentalists. He would teach at the Concord School, and he was famous for giving these 5-hour lectures about Plato. And people would go take canoe rides, or they'd have picnics, and they'd go do something else and come back, and he'd still be lecturing. But he was said to be very inspiring. And because of him, the Platonist happened, and also there were these clubs that occurred, that these Plato clubs that were mostly made up of these wealthier women in these Western towns who were looking for some kind of culture, and they would celebrate Plato's birthday, and they would read. Some of them even went into studying Greek so they could read the dialogues of Plato in the original, but they would read the dialogues in English out loud and such. And I just kept researching. So as I was on tour with my band, I would go to bookstores, I would go to any kind of library that I could get around, especially college libraries, looking for more information. And it kept leading to more and more astonishing facts. So, for example, I found out that Thomas Johnson was not only the publisher of the Platonist, but he was also the leader of the Western lodge of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And he was involved in all kinds of interesting publishing, including being the first person in America to publish any kind of Sufi mysticism. And he also was someone who really was a major influence on the transcendentalists because of these translations. So that's how it started. And ultimately it led to so many forgotten characters and so many really, to me, I thought, wonderful stories that this giant book is the result.
Yes, yes. I mean, Andrew and I were looking at it and we're like, yeah, that's pretty thick, right? I mean, I love my history. Andrea, as I told you earlier, is unable to join us unfortunately today just because he had some obligations he had to attend. However, I know like one of the things we were looking at specifically, it's like we kept seeing this trail of things where you went from one individual to another individual. Like it was almost um, a game of tag, or it was more of this like catch me if you can type of effect. So, did you find any particular individuals that you found like, oh wow, this is something I did not expect whatsoever, but ended up into a much bigger picture?
So many, actually. For that example, I would say Thomas Harriot, the pagan
Yep.
pilgrim who got his own chapter, and Thomas Morton, the pagan
Right.
pilgrim who got his own chapter, and Thomas Harriot, who was the first scientist most likely to try an experiment in America. He was part of Walter Raleigh's mission to America. And they were fascinating. And so there's I think it's about split evenly, chapters that look deeply into a single character and who was around them, and then chapters that are more like surveys that put a lot of different people into context. However, I found them all fascinating and surprising, and so I could tell you that the book could have been twice as big. I'm always running into new things I wish I could put in there, and I have many things that we decided not to put in because it was simply already too much. But the goal was to try to capture how really enormous this body of forgotten knowledge, for the most part, is. And thanks to a revolution in academia that occurred in the 2000s, but particularly in the 2010s and on into the 2020s, there were so many new studies of these obscure esoteric moments, some of which had been written about and many of which really had not. And so there was new information about people who we thought we knew about, like John Winthrop the Younger, for example. And there was also new people that I'd never run into, many of them that had fascinating stories to tell, and so many more. And that's one reason why I recommend to anyone, if you're interested in these matters and these stories, search out Matt Marble and his Instagram account. And he's an amazing source of this kind of information every day, because it's like the shadow of America in a sense. There's There's literally hundreds, thousands of people and events, and all have been left out of history, but they provide a very different picture of America. And so that's why the book is so big, because to try to do that, to try to say, since the very beginning, America has been a mecca for the esoteric, and then to show that over 4 centuries essentially takes a lot of space.
Right. So am I hearing a possible second book then coming out from you on this?
I hope not. Well, I do have another book coming out in summer that I co-wrote with Tamara Lucid that it's partly a similar survey, although not nearly as lengthy, of the influence of Orpheus, the mythology, and the mysteries on Western culture, not just esoteric, but counterculture in particular, because the influence of Orphic ideas has been absolutely essential to so many countercultures. And that also includes a new rendering of the Orphic hymns that we try to make them a little bit more palatable and understandable, because the original hymns, if you've ever run into them, are very formulaic. They get very boring, and the priests were expected to know everything about the deities that were being summoned or called out to or requested for help, however you want to say it, or were being sung to. And these priests, they had information we don't. So what Tamara and I did is we went and studied deeply the various cult activities around all the deities mentioned, and then filled out these hymns with the details that the priests would have known, so that we can get a flavor for the correspondences that these deities represent.
Absolutely makes sense. I mean, yeah. I mean, Greek stuff, it's a whole paradigm. So, I mean, there's just so much to it. Even through each city, there were so many different perspectives.
Yeah, it's incredible.
So with the context of so many different influences in America, I mean, how did you find that they reconciled in the soup of, well, so many different perspectives? I mean, you have things like Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Sufism, Christianity. There's a lot more you've talked about in the book. How did you see that reconciled in people, or just even as a survey of American culture?
Well, I think that has to do with the field of study called American metaphysical religion, which has only now begun to gain credibility in esoteric and in academic circles. So the really watershed book was published by Yale by Catherine Albanese, and it's called A Republic of Mind and Spirit. And this really crystallized the idea that there is something called American metaphysical religion, but it's a real debate, because there are many scholars who feel that it isn't anything but an umbrella term for a lot of superstitions or traditions that are outside the norm of the institutions that are considered worthy of historical study. And then there are others who think that maybe it's an actual religion that's forming in the melting pot of America, as all of these various esoteric and not esoteric spiritual practices and beliefs are all kind of combining together into something different. And so from my point of view, what we're looking at is a combination of yes. I mean, what fascinates me is whatever this thing is, and I'm not prepared to argue that it exists or that it doesn't. I like to keep an open mind about it. And
Right.
we won't know for a long time. Look how long it took for Rome to be kind of colonized by the religion of the Greeks, who they conquered. And so, but what I was looking for was why was it left out of history? Did it have some resemblance or some connections to some esoteric stream? And what I found was that it was astonishing, first, how much they were all influencing each other, coming from various traditions. So even in the earliest days, you had, for example, I mentioned John Winthrop the Younger. I like to use him as an example because it's kind of shocking. When you know that John Winthrop the Elder was the pilgrim who was the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and we have this very set idea of what the pilgrims were like, and they were very devout Christians. But what we discover is that John Winthrop the Younger, his son, was actually an avid alchemist, somebody who was deeply influenced by Rosicrucian ideas, and who actually traveled to Europe with a friend to try to find Rosicrucians to study with. And when he couldn't find anyone that impressed him, he came home and he decided to apply Rosicrucian principles in his life. And when he came to America, he brought with him these big crates that contained alchemical equipment, but also books and manuscripts that included the good chunk of the library of John Dee.
Right.
And so he actually had the mark of John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica on his crates that were being brought to America. And that's a pretty shocking thing for a pilgrim to do. And yet it didn't really cause any shock because his father was also interested in alchemy. And perhaps most surprising of all, Cotton Mather, who we think of as this very conservative Christian who was responsible in some ways for the Salem tragedy, that when he was writing a eulogy for John Winthrop the Younger, he referred to him as Hermes Christianus, or the Christian Hermes. And for a pilgrim to refer back to, either way you look at it, it could be Hermes as in the ancient Greek god, or it could be Hermes as in Hermes Trismegistus in the Hermetic tradition, more likely. And of course, they're related. For a Christian, supposedly very conservative Christian, to refer to someone that he admired greatly as the Christian Hermes indicates a Hermetic influence that really surprised me among the pilgrims. Then when you find out that Harvard College and Yale, that these places had alchemical laboratories in them in their early years, and that some of the presidents were alchemists. And one of the presidents of Yale was a fellow who met just by chance a Kabbalist, a rabbi who was traveling through various colonies, and he was in America for a while, and they had these deep conversations that alerted this man to Kabbalah. And he was so moved by it and so inspired by it that he suggested that every college in America should teach Kabbalah. So, and this is all early, pre-revolutionary. Yeah. And then you can go even further back and see the Shakers and the Quakers experimenting with what is really trance channeling. One of the stories was that some of the Shaker girls heard music in the air, and the music was so heavenly that it caused them to pass out. They were carried home to their beds and they started to prophesy, and they were called sleeping prophets, just as Edgar Cayce would be much later. And there's many more examples. And so every single era of America that I looked at had these kinds of examples. So you could say that maybe the book was defined by a search for anomalies, but what I found was that they weren't really anomalies at all, that you could make an argument that they were actually the center of a lot of American culture.
Right, because I know even like further toward the end of the book, and even that one part with the Quakers, like, you know, this music connection you were mentioned to metaphysics. So can you get into that more?
Sure. Well, that's throughout, but in the very early days, we have the German pietists who are influenced by the Rosicrucian Revolution in Europe and its failure, and they are influenced by people like Bamy and by Paracelsus, and they are not comfortable practicing, because even among the Protestants who were rebelling against Catholic authoritarianism and censorship, there was a strong sense that some things were right and some things were wrong. And the German pietists were getting into some things that were questionable. These Bamy, for example, had these incredible visions of what the actual nature of creation and the relationship between the creation and divinity, what it looks like, how it can be mapped out symbolically so that we can have a cosmic consciousness kind of experience and awaken our souls. And this was taking power away from the established clergy. So German pietists started coming to America very early and traveled deeply into what was then wilderness when they went to Pennsylvania. And ultimately you have a community called Ephrata, where this beautiful music was created. The people who sang it had to have special diets. They had to have certain prayers and meditations, and astrology was taken into consideration. They had telescopes on top of their tallest building. And this music was meant to reflect heavenly music. It became so well known that people would travel who were music aficionados from Europe, opera lovers, to hear this. And we have records of people who said it was it was by far the most beautiful and moving music they ever heard. But it's impossible for us actually to hear it because the singers, there's no one that's properly prepared, and there isn't the kind of community that can support the kind of effort that it takes to do these complex compositions. So that's just one example, because there were more, and some of them left these beautiful books with symbols, hand painted symbols, like the secret symbols of the Rosicrucians is a very popular one. And so this continued. The thing about America that's so fascinating is that people come here in the first place to get away from being told how to practice religion and how to live. And in a way also, let's face it, I mean, England didn't really want the pilgrims around.
No, they were
they were a
pushing them
problem.
out. So.
Yeah, so it was like, yeah, go to America and do what you want. But then what would happen is somebody would, like John Winthrop the Younger, would become an alchemist with Rosicrucian interests, and he didn't like living in the community that his father developed. So he went off and he became the governor of the Connecticut territory. And so there was an entirely different kind of approach. Or you could see somebody who would leave Boston and then start a community where everyone was welcome. And this is like Thomas Morton is a good example of this, the pagan pilgrim. He's a guy who's 50 years old or so when he's sent out to America to be a competitor on behalf of the Royalists and the Cavaliers. Very different kind of people from the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims had these strict rules against laughter and against running. You weren't supposed to hurry when you were going anywhere, and you had to really be moderate all the time. And the Cavaliers, they loved to get drink, and they wore these big obscene cod pieces, and they were famous for fornication, and a completely different kind of person, but loving culture and knowing Shakespeare and being able to quote Shakespeare at length. And so he had grown up at a time when Queen Elizabeth the First was the monarch during most of his life. And as a child, he actually was afraid of the Spanish Armada, which was headed toward England at that time.
Pretty reasonable.
When he gets to America, he starts a community called Marymount. And Marymount had a lot of puns involved in it. So it was a pun on sex. It's a merry mount, but it was also Mary's Mount, but it was also a pun on a Latin word for the male genitalia. And he was very into puns. And he also was the first guy to write a fart joke in America. And he was the first party to get closed down for being too wild in America. And he was also the first American foreclosed upon by a corporation, which were the Pilgrims. He was also, unlike the Pilgrims who would later embrace slavery, he was against it. And he actually saved some people from being sent to tobacco plantations. So while the Pilgrims had to have walls, and they were very afraid of the wilderness, which they saw as satanic, and they were very afraid of the tribes, Morton, he loved to know what the indigenous people were thinking, how they practiced, what their religion was, how their families were. And he was famous for having a May Day party where he put up this giant yellow pine with ribbons on it. He wrote this bawdy poem, and he invited everybody, pirates and trappers and outlaws and all the local indigenous tribes and the Pilgrims, of course, who didn't attend. And these parties were rumored by the Pilgrims to have been debauched and drunken, but the historical record says otherwise. And in fact, Morton himself said that he found the indigenous women to be more modest than the women back home in England. So this was an alternative view of America, if you will, at the very beginning, where there was this encouragement of diversity and this acceptance. And so he was somebody who loved the American wilderness, and he would go hunting. He mapped out where there were special springs of special qualities. So one spring was said to make you sleepy when you drank it, and another one bubbled up in an actual crystal. And he just thought America was the most beautiful and wonderful environment. But the Pilgrims were not willing to allow him to continue doing what he was doing. He was too much competition. Ironically, when they arrested him, he was there during one of their worst winters, and he offered to go hunt food for them. He didn't understand why they just didn't go out and hunt. And they allowed him to do so, and he came back with food, but he didn't have enough for everybody. And so they did not allow the poorest among them to partake of that food. And when he offered to go get them food because there's plenty to be gotten, they refused, which he found horrifying. And he eventually just left. He escaped. They tormented him. They moored him. They starved him. They sent him on a slow boat ride back to England. They fought in courts in England, and it didn't turn out very well for Tom. And obviously, as we know, the Pilgrims were the ones who left the greatest impression. But he's a typical example of somebody I found that I'd never heard of and who was such a moving character. And to me, so American in a sense, a different kind of American that we all recognize, the welcoming party animal American kind of person, but somebody who has culture. So he would have fit in great with the hippies or many other countercultures that have occurred.
Yeah, I mean, it's these types of things, especially being so early in the history too. It's not what you think, especially with like Pilgrims. There's a certain stereotype of like, all right, they're New England, all that type of stuff. But then you get a character like him, and it's like, oh well.
Yeah, and then you also there's research that came out as early as 1979. John Butler wrote a book where he was examining historical records related to the membership in Christian congregations in the colonies. And he found that in the 1650s in New England, only about 1 out of 3 adults ever belonged to a church at all. And that the rate was even lower in the middle and southern colonies. And even by the time of the American Revolution, it had shrunk further, and only about 15% of the colonists seemed to belong to churches. There are complaints even going into 1687. There's a New York governor who says these people they won't go sit in the pews. They have their own ideas. They don't want to be an organized church. And so we are told that this was all Christian, but what we find is that it really wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, if we go forward a little bit, I mean, I love the chapter name. I found it kind of punny, actually, when you said the uncivil war, right? But you know how there's a split in the psyche of America. So let's talk a bit more about that, because I found that particularly interesting.
Okay, thank you. It's in the Civil War. In the North, there was a feeling that slavery had always been a stain and a danger to America. And there had been people fighting it for a long time. One of the chapters is about a woman whose nickname was the Red Harlot of Liberty, Frances Wright. She was an incredible orator and this brave Scottish young woman who traveled with her sister all through America. She became friends with Thomas Jefferson and Lafayette. But she had this strange experience because she got here at a time when everyone was really involved with the new Constitution and the recent revolution. She was stunned that sailors and farmers were reading Plato, and there was all this intellectual discussion. But the following generation, when she came back, they didn't care about any of that. They were a bunch of capitalists already, and they were a much different kind of people. When she encountered slavery, she was really horrified by it, and she tried to do something about it. And nothing obviously happened. And so in the North, this had been boiling for a long time. And the idea that slavery had to be eliminated from America. And also the British were very supportive of the Confederacy, and there was still the threat even then of the British coming back in some way to dominate America. However, in the South, they felt that the North, that these were Satanists essentially, because spiritualism had become extremely popular. And it was actually as big as some church denominations in terms of numbers. And to them, this was simply trafficking with the dead, necromancy, and it was forbidden by the Bible. But up in the North, it was considered almost like scientific exploration. What is this stuff?
Right.
Why are we getting table tapping? And how is some girl able to suddenly give details about something she never heard of? And on and on. It was seen as a scientific discovery, really. And so this was kind of a religious battle that occurred at a certain point, because the South felt that it was defending itself from what you could call a satanic industrial power in the North. that wanted to come down and destroy this civilization. And the South had a history of, for instance, having cities that were called the Athens of Georgia or the Athens of
Yes.
Alabama. And so they were studying Plato, and they had an interest in culture that was not really interesting to the North, where science and industrialization were really growing quickly and dominating the economy and the culture. And so this split in the North, part of the thing that happened with spiritualism was it gave voice to women, and women who had been treated as though they really could not in any way contribute to politics or to culture suddenly found themselves in front of auditoriums full of men who were hanging on their every word, and they could criticize the culture. They could say that they were channeling Demosthenes, as Victoria Woodhull did, and address Congress and give a brilliant speech about why there should be freedom for women and why slavery had to end. And of course, there was a very strong connection between spiritualism and feminism,
Mhm.
the suffragette movement, and between feminism and the fight against slavery. So enslaved people who were escaping to the North were finding themselves protected by people who were also feminists, and some of them were spiritualists. And one of them, by the way, was Hiram K. Jones, the great Platonist, who was called the American Plato that we had discussed earlier.
Yes.
One of those intersections again. So as we grow out of there, what we find is that in the North, and let's face it, it was limited. The embrace of diversity was very limited and very controlled. And yet, in a way, it was opened up to a degree that could never happen in the South. And ultimately, when Lincoln allows men of color to be armed, to go into the South to help free their own people, this is a very radical move that brings America together in the North and establishes a new trajectory, because women are understood as being intelligent, and they do have things to say. And we find that men of color also, somebody like Frederick Douglass, is in every way the equal of the finest men in the North who are
Mhm.
Caucasian. And in the South, they're now struggling to protect this old order that had flourished for them. And they felt that, for example, that enslaved people were benefited. And they found in the Bible the reason why it was okay to have enslaved people. They're in the Bible.
Right.
Up north, no one wanted to hear that. The Bible didn't matter. They weren't going to
Mhm.
church. They were imbibing the American transcendentalists, and they felt that they were dragging the South into the modern world.
Right,
And
because from the Northern perspective, it's more of a humanist value set, right? So,
exactly, yeah. So I think that that's still going on. And we see, for example, that we still have a strong dominionist movement where they don't want separation of church and state, and where there is this assumption still in America that if this is a Christian country, the Christians know what's best. And if this country ever gets away from Christianity, it will fail and be punished in some terrible way. But we actually have this very rich history of people doing the opposite and
mhm.
establishing precedents for us that are pretty thrilling. And so that was another reason I wrote the book, was to illuminate that split and to hopefully show America its shadow, in a sense, and say, look at all these crazy esoteric people, and I use the word crazy in a positive way,
Right.
who simply did what they thought they had to do to find the truth as it was presented in their lives. And so let's use the example of somebody like Phineas Quimby,
Mhm.
who was really the inventor of the mind cure and is much looked to by the New Thought movement, and of course was the teacher, in a sense, of Mary Baker Eddy, and so could be considered the father of the Christian Scientist movement. And here he is. He just has this, he's pretty much an illiterate guy, and he's a big believer in the Bible. And it occurs to him that spirit, our souls, and what it says in the Bible about Christ and healing and the body should have a very different relationship from what they have. And so if you're sick, the reason is because your soul is not fully inhabiting your body. And so you must set yourself right with your soul and with God in order to be healed. And he had this great motto where he would say that health is how the body experiences the eternity of the soul. Well, in the South, that was just madness.
Right.
Who gave you the right to be healing like that? And you're talking people out of their illnesses. I mean, you're supposed to go to church. You're supposed to, this is for the holy people to do, not just some guy who's an illiterate who had to have the Bible read to him. And so in the North, they were constantly inventing new religions, and in the South as well, especially later on. One of the people that I've had an interview with was in Europe, and he just said, why does America invent so many religions? My answer was, because people came here to get away from being told how to practice religion. And once they got here, they usually found out that the people they came over with, they wound up disagreeing with too. So they went off and built another religion that reflected their beliefs even more.
Right. And I mean, it's interesting to see the interweaving of things. And, from a practitioner standard, I'm looking at things where it's like, well, what works and what doesn't work, right? Like that is very American on that new world perspective, using scientific methods. Say, what is the best formulaic way about going about things? Does it work? Maybe test it out, experiment, right? And
exactly.
When we're looking, like, we've talked a lot about this north-south dichotomy. Let's talk about the east-west dichotomy, because I know you do talk about that also.
Yeah. Well, the West, it's interesting. California in particular, particularly Southern California, have long been considered a place that there would be some sort of big spiritual development by earlier generations of Americans. Madame Blavatsky said that she thought the next root race would come out of Southern California. And as California began to develop, it was a great place to come because things were cheap. It was beautiful. The weather was incredible. People were sent here for their health. And because a lot of people were sent here for their health, and because it was cheap and it was so wide open, a lot of both good and bad spiritually inclined people followed. And so you had swamis from India, and you had faith healers, and you had the invention of the Aquarian gospel of Jesus the Christ, and all these organizations came to life here. Now, most of this was looked at with a rather sour expression by the East, where culture had been the likes of the New England transcendentalists, and there was a more traditional approach. The idea was, well, if you're into this stuff, why don't you join the Moravian Church or one of the esoteric orders that's been here for a while? Why are you inventing something brand new? And some of that was sincere. Some of these inventions were because people had some kind of revelation, or they were following a vision that they were given. But there were a lot of frauds as well. And one of the things that the book taught me was that you could find wisdom among the frauds. And even some of the worst cases of it, there were sometimes things that they did that were really quite remarkable. And many of the people that were held up as being absolutely the perfect spiritual specimen turned out to have clay feet. And that's okay, because we're human. So this kind of really happens when the New Age occurs in the 80s. Because in Los Angeles, with the Bodhi Tree bookstore, which was a really wonderful metaphysical bookstore run by some rocket scientists, it kind of went out of control. It was like people who had been hippies. The old hippie movement developed into the New Age movement. It was going to be the Aquarian age and the Aquarian conspiracy. And it was amazing what happened, because, for example, when I interviewed Mary Kay Greer, a wonderful author on the tarot, who also wrote a great book on the women of the Golden Dawn, she was telling me that when she was a student in the 60s in Florida, she could not find a tarot deck. And eventually had to drive to the far side of town to this kind of seedy metaphysical store to get one, which she found out through word of mouth was there. But once California gets rolling, the Bodhi Tree had a whole giant case full of tarot cards, and people were making tarot cards to be in the Bodhi Tree case because you could make your living that way for a time. And when I spoke to Adam McLean, who's probably the world's foremost collector of tarot cards, and asked him, well, how many decks do you think there are now? He said he lost count. I think it was around 8,000 something. And that he said, I think very correctly, that it's now turned into an artistic form, a political form. It's a kind of media instead of being strictly for oracular use. So here in California, it seemed that all the hybrids were welcomed with open arms, while there was still some skepticism in the East. And the East was reluctant to give kind of approval to what was happening here. And there's a lot of mixing that occurred. And this is why you find something like Zen or Sufi, which are parts of more traditional religious institutions, in a book about American metaphysical religion, because not only did they influence deeply American metaphysical religion, but also American metaphysical religion influenced them as in the way that it was practiced in America. So, for example, later in the book, I write about how over time, the first Zen community in Los Angeles, which had a wonderful teacher who, just like many Zen teachers, like the great master Ikkyu in Japan, had a taste for alcohol and for the ladies. And he got in a lot of trouble because this was not acceptable. But in the long run, he placed a woman into a position of power, and that community is now run by a woman who was the first to initiate a woman of color as a Zen master. And they have a completely different approach to Zen than traditional Japanese schools, where they're welcoming children and they're having family events. And it's a new approach to it. So I found that fascinating to see how traditional teachers would come here and be changed, because you had liquor at every liquor store. You had women who were impressed and were sexually, sometimes even predatory or easily victimized on the other hand. And this brought out elements in these people that they did not have to face in the same way in their own cultures.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's such a great explanation of that, because it's like, even when I look, it's like California is a major hub for multiple mixings. I mean, even my background, I'm coming from a Chinese medicine background, but in America, it was California that had it first with acupuncture moving forward. It's the oldest sport in North America. So when you're seeing things like these elements come in, it makes sense how it will almost flourish in California, but then as it moves back east or through that Midwest corridor, things get a little more clunky, right?
Yes. And you've even got the example, I would say, of look at Bruce Lee coming over, and amongst his earliest students were African American men. And so you had a strong influx of Kung Fu culture into the African American community, which really affected quite a lot. And since then, for instance, there's a teacher named Voice Rogers in Los Angeles who synthesized some of the African styles of self-defense into, and then the jail styles, right? What was developed by prisoners when enslaved people. He pointed out, for example, that some of the dances that enslaved people did were actually martial arts. And so that is such a huge influence that continues to ripple throughout our culture.
Yes, I know, like, I think Capoeira from Brazil actually does have a similar type of thinking around, like, we can't really show we're fighting, so we're just going to hide it and make it look like dance moves, right?
Exactly.
So what did you find impacted you the most while you're writing this? Because this is a whole journey you're describing, like, not just through the history of America and all these different places, but for yourself personally.
That's a good question. First, I fell in love with all of them. So I had also internalized the split and had a very us versus them mentality about religion in America. And I came from a background in Riot Girl and punk rock, and we did a lot of Rock for Choice shows. And so we really had this feeling that we were fighting against this enemy. But as I did the book and I saw how blurry these lines can become, and even today, you do have Christians who are exploring auras and orbs and all sorts of stuff that you wouldn't think that Christians were interested in. And that helped me to, and I have to say, I mean, it sounds like hyperbole, but I really kind of fell in love with all of them, because they were so daring to be doing these things, to try to do what Emerson said we should do, which is, instead of having a relationship with the spiritual or with the divine that was created long ago, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and that this idea is how we have to do it, why can't we have our own direct revelation?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that America has just been this giant experiment of people trying to do that, to have their own experiences, to reinvent. And so it always makes me think of one of the quotes that's at the beginning of the book by Kukai, the great Shingon master
Mm-hmm.
in Buddhism, who said, "Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the men of old. Seek what they sought." And in traditional religion, for the most part, you are following the footsteps of the men of old. But in America, you see this continual process of reinvention. And I argue that American metaphysical religion, to some degree, transformed American Christianity so dramatically that you could almost say that it resembles American metaphysical religion more than it resembles Christianity as it used to be known.
Right.
So the key to that, I think, is another book that Catherine Albanese wrote that she just published about the influence of the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness, she argues, is in essence what has made America different in terms of its spirituality and in terms of how religions change in America. Because if we look at traditional patriarchal monotheism, but particularly Christian, we have to fear nature. This world is a trap for the soul. This is Satan's world, and Satan will take our soul from us for eternity. And so we must do exactly what we're told and obey the good book, or else what will happen to us will be something horrible. And when we come to America, suddenly we have the idea that the pursuit of happiness is the right of every person, and that therefore this becomes the idea that God wants us to be happy. So this can be New Thought or Christian prosperity gospels, where people believe that if they're in good spiritually, they'll become wealthier, or that they can pray, or they can use ritual or imagination in order to manifest what they desire. And that ultimately their job here, as is said in the Kabbalah, is to perfect the world. And to perfect the world makes one happy, because one becomes a success in the world. That's a very different idea from we need to suffer in order to actually learn, and we should not have a good life here. We shouldn't become rich, because if we become rich, then we're really going to never get into heaven. And we should expect bad things to happen, and our joy will come to us later. In America, in the Christian churches, and in all the esoteric teachings, the joy comes to us now.
Right. That's radically different compared to, because again, it's almost this again, melting pot from East and West. And we're not even talking about the indigenous cultures and their viewpoints, right? So this becomes a whole different thing, because on one spectrum with the European side, you got more of this guilt complex from the Judeo-Christian split. And then from the other end, if we're saying like East Asia, we're going to say like, Korea, China, Japan, you have a safe face culture or a shame culture. And then the indigenous, you have this whole different viewpoint of how to interact where there's no property and things like this. So when you get to getting all these intermingled, there's going to be a little bit of bumping with that at the same time.
It's fascinating to see how some of the earliest colonists were so interested in indigenous culture that they looked at it and they began to wonder about European culture. So some of them said things such as, these people are healthier than we are. Their senses are sharper. They can see further. They can hear further. They have better family lives. They treat their elderly better. They treat their children better. And a couple of the writers actually dared to say they don't have to erect walls or own guns to protect what they own, because they share everything. And they were better at agriculture than the original colonists. And so, and even some recognized that the way that they lived in harmony with nature was a whole different approach to life. And I wonder if, when I look at this idea, could American metaphysical religion actually become an organized religion? Because it's so big now that if
Right.
you include all the people that are interested in things like witchcraft, tarot, astrology, all the different kinds of omenry, and just
Hmm.
all of that, everything that doesn't fit into institutionalized religion or atheism, you're talking about something that's as big or bigger than the Methodist Church. It's millions of people.
Yes.
And so if should it become self-aware, it has no self-awareness now. It thinks, most of us think that we're on the fringe. There's not a whole lot of us. What happens when millions of people who have these esoteric interests and practices, who are not identical, but they can recognize in each other similarities? What happens when they see themselves as a group? And I think we saw a flicker of that when Marianne Williamson was running for president, and she is again, because when she made her statement about dark forces in politics, a whole bunch of people got excited because they understood what she meant by that. So now there's a kind of still a hostility toward her because they laugh about her being into crystals, and they don't realize how many people out there are actually thinking the way she is in their own
Hmm.
ways. So what happens if it becomes institutionalized? Well, my hope is that if there's going to be some sort of a new religion that comes out of America, that it strongly reflects the indigenous values. And as we said earlier, that's not unusual. If you think about what happened in India when the Aryans came sweeping in from the north, but ultimately they become practitioners of the religion of the conquered. It took
Yes.
centuries. We're only in America into the 2nd century. So the question becomes, could we eventually, given the state of the world and the necessities involving the environment, can we adopt a more indigenous point of view? And so one thing I would throw in here is what happened at Standing Rock. And most people know of the Standing Rock protest as a really powerful protest that the whole world was following. And
Hmm.
of course, it did not succeed at its goal, although it did later, because there was trillions of dollars of divestment and petroleum investments that were
Right.
inspired by that. But Tamara and myself, to a lesser degree, were involved in a documentary about it called "End of the Line: The Women of Standing Rock," and we got to talk to many people that were there, and what we found was that they were all talking about spiritual experiences. We kept
Mm.
hearing things like, the veil is thinner here than I've ever seen it before. We kept hearing stories about telepathic moments when somebody would say, wow, we really need to get some bags because we're all out of bags, and without them, we won't be able to continue. And then a bunch of bags would arrive just in time with nobody having arranged it. Or one that I found very fascinating was that there were dreams, that people had dreams of people like Russell Means, who was a great indigenous activist and known as an actor, and who had passed before Standing Rock. And the director of the film, the producer of the film, and other people who joined the protest, many people, they had vivid dreams of Russell Means saying to them, what are you waiting for? Get up there. And
Mm.
so there was a strongly spiritual set of circumstances there within the political protest, and people took home these experiences and had a very different feeling about what's real and what isn't real. And so I think one could see a future where more indigenous ideas about living in harmony with nature become embraced in a way that we probably can't imagine right now.
Well, this also gets into, like, now we've hit to the last parts of the book where you're talking about the 20th century and how
Mhm.
all these different impacts. And the one chapter that kind of stood out to me, particularly as a sub part, was the Sekhmet revival, right?
Mhm.
So that in itself, because you were talking, like, this kind of fits into that bill a little bit. So can you describe a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I'll be giving a lecture about it, I think about a month from now, almost
Oh,
exactly,
well,
for the
there you
Last
go.
Tuesday Society. Yeah, that's fascinating to me. So here we have this deity. It's a lion-headed woman, is how she's usually depicted, from ancient Egypt. Not a very popular ancient Egyptian goddess in history. somebody that was a protector of the pharaoh. And the famous story told about this goddess was that when human beings became disrespectful because the great god became old, they stopped to worship, and they were beginning to live immoral lives. And greatly offended by this, the summoning occurred of Sekhmet. And Sekhmet is the protector of Ma'at, or the balance that allows life to exist. Well, when Sekhmet came down here to punish the wicked, what she discovered was that all human beings are wicked to some degree. And so she set off to kill everybody. They figured out, some to say that Thoth figured this out, others say Horus figured it out, that they would take a big lunar-shaped pool and fill it with beer, and they would dye it red with pomegranate juice. And she would think it was blood, and like a lioness would, she would stop and drink it, and she would get drunk. And when she got drunk, she would turn into a completely different goddess, Hathor, who was a goddess of beauty and love, comparable in some ways to Aphrodite. So this goddess slipped out of history, and you could see her once in a while in something like an old movie where some Egyptology influenced set designer copied a Sekhmet statue because it looked so striking. But that was about the only place you could ever run into her, except possibly in a museum or in some rare Egyptian tome about ancient Egypt, something by Budge, for example. And there were some inklings in the 70s. So, for instance, John Lennon and Yoko bought this giant Sekhmet statue, and Yoko appears to have had a lifelong interest in Sekhmet. And at one time, she had a company called Sekhmet Productions. Well, in the 1980s, something happened. Part of it was due to somebody named Robert Masters, and he was experimenting with psychedelics, but also with depth psychology. And he had some experiences with some of the people he was working with where there were these intrusions by this goddess Sekhmet. And the people that she intruded upon instantly became adoring devotees. And she ultimately intruded on him, and he became one too. And he wrote a book about her that became kind of the bursting out, or as he called it, the cat is out of the bag. Now, others, however, even earlier, were having dreams and such. So I spoke to people who talked about, one person in particular talked about having a dream about a lion-headed stick of incense and hearing the name Sekhmet. And they went and looked up this word everywhere they could think of. This was prior to the internet, and they could not find it anywhere.
Right.
And eventually they ran into Master's book years after this. So, and then there were some women also who created revivals of Egyptian religion. And in some cases, Sekhmet was a salient point of that. But then, then all of a sudden in the 2000s, who knows why, maybe it's just the internet. And you could argue, as I mentioned in the book, that maybe it's just because she's such a picturesque goddess. Her statuary and her, it's lovely. It's a lioness head on a lovely woman's body. So if you're a cat lover, what's not to love? But suddenly this exploded exponentially. There were, I can't tell you, I mean, there's anything you can think of ordering: pillowcases, sheets, blankets, cups, t-shirts. There were metal bands named Sekhmet. There were biotech companies named Sekhmet. There's a new Sekhmet temple that was built in Nevada, and on and on. Sekhmet appeared as a character in Wakanda in the Marvel comic universe as one of the gods worshipped in Wakanda. And so I won't bore your listeners or viewers with all of the details, because you can simply Google it and see all the things.
There's a lot.
And so, and of course, other goddesses and gods are also experiencing resurgences, but we didn't find anything quite so dramatic as this. And so much so that in academia, there's actually been work done, because they're talking about this phenomenon where people are coming to museums, and some of them are already worshipers of Sekhmet, but many of them are not. And they encounter the statues and they have deeply emotional reactions. There are people who just burst out crying, who get down on their knees in front of the statue in the museum. And academia is looking at it both as a fascinating phenomenon of human psychology, but also they're saying that it's changed, this kind of activity changes the museum into a temple for those people.
Yeah, no, I think it was something I read a news article, like someone was doing, I forget what culture in particular, I think it was Thailand, and someone was doing a traditional dance in the Louvre, and that was a discussion piece altogether, because they're like, well, this is the stuff we work with, this is what our ancestors have worked with, and the Louvre was having some hard discussions what that means.
Exactly. And one of the weirdest things is the constant reporting of phenomena involving Sekhmet statues, movements, or people take pictures and the eyes. There's a meme that just went around recently on TikTok where it was a photo that seemed to capture what looked like an Egyptian priest. I mean, when it was put up against a line drawing or a painting of an Egyptian priest, the details of this alleged apparition absolutely resembled it. And then the statue itself seemed to have moved. It was leaning in this other direction, and the eyes seemed to be looking toward the camera. And often we see these lit up eyes in pictures of Sekhmet. And so somebody was on TikTok going, "What is this? How did this happen?" And so a lot of phenomenon around it, which goes back to Iamblichus writing about how they used to ensoul statues in Egypt.
Yes. I mean, that I found like, yeah, because even with the cat comment, it's like, well, Sekhmet has a cat head and the female's body. It's like, well, Basset doesn't get those effects. So that's an interesting wormhole to even think through, because I mean, they're both feline type goddesses. Yeah, you're seeing a big resurgence with Sekhmet, but Basset not so much. I mean, there is a little bit, right? Just not as much as you're saying.
It's interesting. There's some obscure theories around the idea that Sekhmet probably, in my opinion, is that Sekhmet is probably going to be found to go all the way back to an African tribal totem, because obviously tribes that are living around lions are going to see that these are matriarchal societies and will probably imitate them to some degree. And there are, like the Kingdom of Kush, examples of really amazing female warriors in Africa. Probably that's where it comes from. And then the idea was that later, as men took over the institutions of religion, we couldn't have this lion-headed goddess running around, maybe for the pharaoh, but not for everybody else. So we're going to give them a nice domesticated cat. And so that was what Bast was. And yet still the same, still the greatest carnivore on the planet, the greatest killer.
Absolutely. Well, looking at the time, it's over an hour. That went by quick. So, Ronnie, do you have anything coming up that you'd like to tell our viewers about?
Well, I am excited about lecturing about Sekhmet for the Last Tuesdays Society. And I think that'll be on May 8th and can be found on Google. And then I do have, besides the Orpheus book that I co-authored, which is coming out in the end of August this year from Inner Traditions, there will also be a book that they just bought from me about Rosicrucian origins and context, going deeply into the new research about where Rosicrucianism came from and how the manifestos came to be and what their influence were within the political context of what was going on. And I find, along with a lot of modern scholars, that we may be looking at something that's surprisingly similar to the Beats or the Situationists, students influenced by professors who are deeply into forbidden topics such as John Dee and Bocciolini and Giordano Bruno, and they get all hopped up on this stuff and excited. And the manifesto has some very satirical elements. All three manifestos, including the Fama, have satirical elements in them. For example, in one of the manifestos, we have Father CRC, Christian Rosenkreutz, and the woman who's showing him around is naked. She's a young woman, and she comments at one point, gee, if you think what we would say, do you think if I let him get laid, that he'd be in a better mood? And this has always been taken as, well, no, you don't take it that way. This is alchemy and it's symbolism. But as you get to understand Johann Andreh's youth,
Right.
you see that he was always writing comedic things and utopias and such. So I found it fascinating. I think in some ways it was, along with the Orpheus counterculture, the most influential counterculture in the West.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sounds like a fun read altogether. So, I mean, when you start comparing it to the Beats, I'm like, yes. Especially when
Yeah.
talking about Bruno and things like that, because that gets into a whole different slew of what Bruno is in terms of memory
Oh yeah, and
techniques and
Ficino.
memory palaces.
We got to go back and look at Ficino and then his influence on Agrippa, because Agrippa is pulling so much from Ficino, and Ficino is giving you Iamblichus, who's the heart of ceremonial magic in the Western tradition.
Right. So lots of fun stuff that you have coming up, either through a written form and or your lecture. So there you go. So before we end off, let's just go over a few more things for our audience again. So in terms of next week, as a reminder, we have our interview at noon with Carl Ambritson. Andrieh and I will be having a conversation with him. Tomorrow we have the ritual with Andrieh, which is connect to God, connecting to crystal spirit within ritual. That'll be at 1:30 for our sponsors. That could be online or in person. So if you want in person, you have to give us an email tonight so we can set up a seat for you, because we only got so much physical space. However, if you're online, you have the link there if you are a sponsor and or if you become a sponsor at the email or the page, queencitycurio.ca/pages/become a member. Every week we have a ritual and or workshop. And then remember, we got our upcoming goodies with Stephanie Colony going through the 72 Goetia and the Semaphorish. So that is a 3-year commitment that we got going on, as Stephanie has pointed out to Andrieh and I on air. So that'll be a fun time, and that is coming up toward the summer. So with that, everyone, keep safe, keep healthy, and then we'll see everyone next week. Andrieh and I will see you all next week, if not tomorrow. Have a great week.
Bye-bye, everybody.